August 15, 1945 arrived with the weight of 6 terrible years pressing down on every soul in the Pacific theater. In a limestone cave on the southern cliffs of Okinawa, 37 Japanese women huddled together in absolute darkness, waiting for the Americans to come. They were nurses, teachers, and members of the Himari student corps, young women between 15 and 19 years old who had been conscripted to serve the Imperial Japanese Army as field nurses during the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Outside, the sound of American voices drifted through the humid August air, speaking words in a language that sounded harsh and foreign, 2 ears trained to expect only cruelty from the enemy. Inside the cave, Instructor Nakasone Season held a single grenade in her trembling hands. She had been given explicit orders by the retreating Japanese officers, if the Americans came, she was to detonate it, killing herself and as many of the girls as possible. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. This was the code they had been taught since childhood. The youngest among them, a girl named Miyagi Kikoko, pressed herself against the cold cave wall and remembered the propaganda films she had watched in school. American soldiers were depicted as demons who would torture, rape, and mutilate any Japanese they captured. The films showed graphic reenactments that had given her nightmares for weeks. Now those nightmares were about to become reality, or so she believed. According to historical records compiled by the Himari Peace Museum in Okinawa, established in 1989 to commemorate these events, approximately 222 members of the Himari Student Corps died during the Battle of Okinawa, many in the final days of June 1945. The women in this particular cave were among the few who survived past the official end of organized Japanese resistance on June 23rd. The American voices grew closer. Someone was calling out in broken Japanese, but the words were incomprehensible over the pounding of blood in the women's ears. Nakasone's finger tightened on the grenade pin. She had watched several of her students die, already blown apart by naval bombardment, buried alive in collapsed field hospitals, or driven to jump from cliffs in mass suicide packs. She could not bear the thought of them suffering further humiliation at American hands. Then something unexpected happened. A canteen rolled into the cave entrance, followed by chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper things no enemy would waste on people they intended to kill. The American voice outside became more insistent, repeating the same phrases over and over. One of the older women, who had studied some English before the war, suddenly gasped. The soldier was not threatening them. He was saying, "Safe now. War over. Come out. No hurt." But trust was impossible. Every lesson, every warning, every propaganda message had prepared them for this moment of deception. The Americans would surely trick them into emerging, then unleash their barbarism. Nakasone's hand remained steady on the grenade as tears streamed down her face. Outside, the American soldier continued his patient vigil, apparently willing to wait forever in the scorching August heat. For 5 years before that August day, the machinery of Japanese wartime propaganda had worked tirelessly to shape the minds of its citizens, particularly its young women. The Ministry of Education had collaborated with the military to create a curriculum that glorified death in service of the emperor and painted Allied force, especially Americans, as subhuman monsters incapable of mercy or honor. In the Okinawan school where many of the Himari students had studied, their days began with bows toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and recitations of the Imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. By 1944, as American forces drew closer to the Japanese home islands, these lessons intensified. Films produced by the Imperial Army's Information Section showed alleged atrocities committed by American soldiers in occupied territories. Though largely fabricated or exaggerated, these images burned themselves into impressionable minds. Nakasone remembered showing some of these films to her students. She recalled the pale faces of 15-year-old girls watching staged scenes of violence and degradation. At the time, she had believed she was preparing them for reality, steeling them for the worst. Now, crouched in the darkness, with her hand on a grenade, she wondered if she had simply traumatized an entire generation for nothing. The militarization of Okinawan schools had accelerated after the fall of Saipan in July 1944. Military officials visited classrooms to recruit girls for nursing duty, framing it as the highest honor a young woman could achieve. Miyagi Kikoko had volunteered enthusiastically, proud to serve her country. Her mother had sewn her a special sash with the words, "7 lives for the nation," a reference to the samurai belief that one should be willing to be reborn 7 times to fight for Japan. The reality of nursing during the Battle of Okinawa bore no resemblance to the noble visions sold to these young women. They worked in underground field hospitals carved into cave systems with no running water, minimal medical supplies, and constant threat of American bombardment. They amputated limbs with ordinary saws, held dying soldiers as they screamed for their mothers, and survived on meager rations of rice balls and occasionally rotten sweet potatoes. By June 1945, as American forces tightened their grip on southern Okinawa, the Japanese army issued orders for all field hospitals to evacuate. The nurses and students were told to move south to new positions, but this was essentially a death sentence. The southern caves were already overcrowded with soldiers and civilians, supplies were non-existent, and American forces surrounded the entire area. Many units received their final orders: dissolve and make your own way. In practice, this meant abandoning the women to their fate. Japanese soldiers who had promised to protect them instead fled under cover of darkness, sometimes taking what little food remained. Some officers, bound by the code that Japanese must never surrender, distributed grenades to civilian groups, including the young nurses, with instructions on how to commit mass suicide when the Americans arrived. This context of systematic indoctrination and abandonment was crucial to understanding the terror that gripped the women in the cave that August day. They genuinely believed death was preferable to capture, not out of personal courage but because they had been conditioned to accept this as absolute truth. Captain William McKinney of the United States Marine Corps had been fighting in the Pacific since the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. He had seen combat on Tarawa, Saipan, and now Okinawa, and the accumulated horrors of 3 years had left him exhausted but not hardened. If anything, the brutality of the Pacific War had made him more determined to preserve whatever humanity remained in this nightmare. McKinney had arrived in Okinawa on April 1st, 1945 Love Day, as the landing was codenamed part of the massive invasion force of 183,000 troops. The battle that followed was unlike anything he had experienced. Japanese forces had abandoned their usual strategy of defending beaches, instead creating an elaborate system of fortified positions in the island's interior. The result was 82 days of grinding, brutal combat that killed 12,520 American servicemen and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians. What haunted McKinney most were the civilian deaths. As American forces pushed south, they encountered increasing numbers of Okinawan civilians who had been caught between the armies. Many had been convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them. McKinney personally witnessed multiple instances of families committing mass suicide jumping from cliffs, detonating grenades, or poisoning themselves rather than face capture. He had tried to prevent these tragedies, calling out assurances in his limited Japanese, but often failed. The sight of children's bodies at the base of cliffs would haunt him for the rest of his life. After organized Japanese resistance ended on June 23rd, McKinney's unit shifted from combat operations to mopping up duty and civilian processing. This involved searching the countless caves that honeycombed southern Okinawa for holdout soldiers and terrified civilians. It was delicate, dangerous work. Some caves contained Japanese soldiers willing to fight to the death, taking Americans with them. Others held civilians so frightened they would detonate explosives rather than emerge. On August 15th, McKinney's unit received word that Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender via radio broadcast. The news should have brought relief, but McKinney knew the danger had not passed. Many Japanese soldiers in isolated positions had not heard the broadcast or refused to believe it. Civilians who had spent months hiding in caves would certainly not trust American assurances that the war had ended. That afternoon, following reports from Okinawan civilians who had already surrendered, McKinney's squad approached a cave complex near the village of Mabuni, where the last Japanese command post had been located. Local civilians reported that a group of young women, likely nurses or student corps members, were hiding inside. The civilians also warned that the women were likely armed with grenades and had been ordered to commit suicide rather than surrender. McKinney approached the cave entrance carefully. He had developed a protocol for these situations over the past months. First, he sent his squad back to avoid appearing threatening. Second, he called out in Japanese that the war was over and they were safe. Third, and most importantly, he waited. Sometimes it took hours or even days, but eventually hunger, thirst, and the reality that they had not been attacked often convinced trapped civilians to emerge. He rolled a canteen of fresh water into the cave entrance, followed by chocolate bars from his rations. Then he began talking, repeating the same simple phrases in his broken Japanese. War over. Emperor surrendered. You safe. No hurt. Come out. Inside the cave, Instructor Nakasone held the grenade so long her hand cramped, but she could not bring herself to pull the pin. Around her, 37 pairs of eyes waited for her decision. Some of the young women were praying silently. Others had written final letters to their families in the darkness, scratching out characters with their fingernails on scraps of cloth they would never be able to send. Miyagi Kikuko found herself thinking about her family's garden back in Shuri, before the battle had destroyed everything. Her father had grown tomatoes and cucumbers, and in summer they would eat them fresh with just a sprinkle of salt. The memory was so vivid she could almost taste them. It seemed absurd that such small, beautiful things had existed in the same world as this dark cave and the grenade in her instructor's hand. The English-speaking woman, whose name was Taira Shizuko, had been a schoolteacher before the war. She had spent a year studying in Manila in 1938, before tensions with America made such exchanges impossible. Now she strained to understand the words being called from outside the cave. The American soldier's accent was terrible, but his meaning was becoming clearer with each repetition. He was genuinely offering them safety. But could they believe him? Tyra remembered the propaganda films with uncomfortable clarity now. She also remembered something else. Her actual experiences in Manila, where American businessmen and tourists had been kind and generous. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Which America was real, the one from her memories, or the one from the propaganda? According to documented accounts from Himari survivors collected by historian Miyagi Ajian, published in his 1991 work on the Battle of Okinawa, the women in various cave groups faced this exact dilemma repeatedly during the final days of the battle. Some groups had chosen mass suicide. Others had emerged and survived. The difference often came down to small, random factors. Whether a particular American soldier showed patience, whether anyone in the group spoke English, whether hunger and thirst overwhelmed fear. Outside, McKinney continued his patient vigil. An hour passed, then two. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple colors that seemed obscenely beautiful given the circumstances. McKinney's commanding officer, Major Patterson, approached to check on the situation. Still no movement? Patterson asked. No, sir. But they haven't detonated either, which means they're thinking about it. That's progress. Patterson nodded. We're getting reports from other units. Some civilians are emerging now that word of the surrender is spreading. Maybe it'll help if they hear it from other Japanese. Worth a try. Patterson sent runners to find Okinawan civilians who had already surrendered and could speak to the women in the cave. Within an hour, an elderly man named Shimabukuro arrived. He had surrendered 3 days earlier and had been shocked to discover the Americans treated him well, feeding him and providing medical care for an infected wound on his leg. More importantly, they had reunited him with his daughter and grandchildren, who had been found in a different cave. Shimabukuro approached the cave entrance with trembling legs, unsure if the women inside would trust him or view him as a traitor. McKinney stayed back, understanding that his presence might make things worse. The old man knelt near the opening and began speaking in the Okinawan dialect, his voice cracking with emotion. I am Shimabukuro from Atoman village, he called out. I was hiding in a cave near Keon Point with my family. 3 days ago, we surrendered to the Americans. I thought they would kill us. We all thought this, but they gave us food. Real food. Rice, canned meat, and fresh water. They treated my infected leg with medicine. And yesterday, they brought me my daughter and my grandchildren. The Americans found them in another cave and kept them safe. Inside the cave, the women stirred. Nakasone's grip on the grenade loosened slightly. The old man's voice sounded genuine, not forced or coerced. He continued speaking. I know what we were told. I saw the same films, heard the same warnings. I was ready to die rather than face American torture. But it was all lies. All lies. The Americans have set up camps for civilians. They are feeding thousands of people. There is a medical tent where doctors, Samaritan doctors, are treating our sick and wounded. I saw them operate on a young boy yesterday, saving his life. These are not the demons we were told about. Taira Shizuko, translated quietly for those who could not fully understand the Okinawan dialect. The women looked at each other in the darkness, their faces barely visible. Could it be true? Had everything been lies? Miyagi Kikoko spoke up, her young voice barely above a whisper. How do we know you are not being forced to say these things? How do we know they won't kill us as soon as we come out? Shimabukuro heard the question and responded immediately. That is what I ask myself, not think. Would they waste food and medicine on us if they planned to kill us anyway? Why would they search for family members and reunite them? I have seen the American soldiers give their own rations to hungry children. I have seen them carry injured elderly people to the medical tents. These are not the actions of demons. The historical record supports Shimabukuro's account. According to U.S. Army records from August 1945, archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, American forces on Okinawa had established multiple civilian internment camps where over 100,000 Okinawan civilians were processed, fed, and provided medical care. The Army's Civil Affairs Division worked to reunite families, provide education for children, and begin the massive reconstruction effort. While conditions in the camps were far from ideal, overcrowding and supply shortages were common, there was no systematic brutality or revenge-taking against Japanese civilians. McKinney, listening to the exchange from a respectful distance, felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Communication was happening. That was the first step. He had learned that forcing the issue only led to tragedy. Patience and proof were the only tools that worked. Inside the cave, a debate erupted among the women. Some wanted to believe Shimabukuro. Others insisted it was a trick. Nakasone found herself in an impossible position. As the senior person present, the decision fell to her. If she chose wrong and the old man was lying, she would lead these young women to their deaths. If she chose wrong and he was telling the truth, she would kill them unnecessarily. She made her decision not based on logic, but on exhaustion. I cannot make this choice for all of you, she said quietly. Each of you must decide for yourself. I am going to put down this grenade. Anyone who wishes to stay and die may do so. Anyone who wishes to take the risk of emerging may follow me. With movements that felt like surrendering her very soul, Nakasone carefully placed the grenade in a crevice of the cave wall and stood up. Her legs barely supported her after hours of crouching. Behind her, she heard rustling as the women considered their options. Then, one by one, they began to rise. Taira Shizuko moved to support Nakasone's arm. If we die together, she said simply. But I would rather die in sunlight than in this darkness. Miyagi Kikoko, the youngest, clutched the hand of another young woman named Yoshida Fumiko. They had been classmates before the war, had volunteered together for nursing duty, and had survived months of horror together. If this was the end, at least they would face it together. The group moved slowly toward the cave entrance, their eyes completely unadjusted to daylight after days in darkness. The opening appeared impossibly bright, a white glare that hurt to look at. They hesitated at the threshold, still half convinced that machine gun fire would greet them the moment they emerged. Shimabukuro called out again, I am here. I am alive. Come out and see the truth for yourselves. Nakasone took the final step, emerging from the cave into the late afternoon sunlight of August 15th, 1945, the day that would reshape not just Japan, but the entire world order. She raised her hands above her head, squinting against the brightness, waiting for the bullet that she still half expected. Instead, she saw McKinney standing about 20 feet away, his rifle slung over his shoulder rather than pointed at her. His hands were raised in a gesture that was clearly meant to be non-threatening. Behind him, other American soldiers waited, but none had weapons drawn. And beside them stood Shimabukuro, alive and apparently unharmed, just as he had claimed. One by one, the 37 women emerged from the cave. They were a shocking sight, emaciated, filthy, their white nursing uniforms stained black with blood and dirt, many injured or sick. Several were so weak they had to be supported by their companions. They stood blinking in the sunlight, a ragged line of traumatized young women waiting for their fate. McKinney moved slowly toward them, making no sudden movements. He pulled out his canteen and offered it to Nakasone. She stared at it, then at him, still unable to fully process that she was alive and not being attacked. Shimabukuro called out encouragement, and finally, Nakasone accepted the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was cool and clean, not the brackish, contaminated liquid they had been surviving on in the cave. McKinney called out in his broken Japanese, and this time Taira Shizuko could understand him clearly. Medical help coming. Food coming. You safe now? War over. As if to confirm his words, 2 American medics approached, carrying medical supplies and stretchers. They moved among the women, making quick assessments of who needed immediate care. One medic, a young man who could not have been more than 20 years old himself, knelt beside Miyagi Kikoko and noticed her infected leg wound. He cleaned it gently and applied antiseptic, his touch professional and completely devoid of the violence she had been taught to expect. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. These women had spent months believing Americans were monsters and seconds disproving everything they thought they knew. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some of the women began crying not from fear or relief exactly, but from the sheer confusion of discovering their entire worldview had been built on lies. By the evening of August 15th, the 37 women from the cave had been transported to a civilian internment camp that the U.S. Army had established near Ishikawa. On the northern part of Okinawa, the camp housed approximately 15,000 Okinawan civilians who had surrendered or been rescued from combat zones throughout the island. It was a sprawling complex of tents, with separate areas for families, unaccompanied women, children, and medical patients. The Himari nurses were taken directly to the medical section, where American military doctors and Navy corpsmen worked alongside a few Japanese and Okinawan medical personnel who had surrendered earlier. The medical tent was chaotic but organized, with supplies that seemed miraculous to women who had spent months operating in caves with almost nothing. Dr. James Wheeler, a Navy surgeon from Massachusetts, examined Nakasone first, through a translator. A Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii, named Sergeant Daniel Kobayashi, explained that she had multiple infected wounds, malnutrition, and probable tuberculosis. She needed immediate treatment and extended rest. Nakasone found herself overwhelmed by the gentleness of the examination. Dr. Wheeler's hands were professional and respectful. He asked permission before touching her, explained what he was doing, and showed genuine concern for her comfort. This was so far removed from her expectations that she began weeping silently, unable to process the contradiction between propaganda and reality. Sergeant Kobayashi, who spoke perfect Japanese, sat beside her and talked quietly while Dr. Wheeler worked. "I know this is confusing," he said. "My grandparents came from Hiroshima. I was born in Hawaii. When the war started, many Americans suspected people like me of being traitors. Some Japanese Americans were put in internment camps in the mainland. My family was lucky Hawaii had too many of us to intern everyone. I joined the army to prove my loyalty to America." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I am trying to say is that I understand how propaganda works. I understand how people are taught to hate and fear those who are different. But I also know that most people on both sides are just trying to survive and take care of their families. The Americans here are not perfect, but they are not the demons you were told about." This account is supported by documented records from the U.S. Army's civil affairs operations on Okinawa, including after-action reports filed by medical personnel, according to a report dated August 1945, preserved in the National Archives. The Ishikawa camp medical facilities treated over 2,000 civilian patients in the first 2 weeks after the surrender announcement, with mortality rates significantly lower than in Japanese military field hospitals during the battle. Over the following days, as the Himari nurses received treatment and slowly regained strength, they began interacting more with both American personnel and other Okinawan civilians in the camp. They heard stories that confirmed what Shimabukuro had told them, stories of American soldiers sharing their rations with hungry children, of medics treating enemy wounded with the same care as their own, of civil affairs officers working to reunite scattered families, Miyagi Kikoko, recovering from her infected leg wound, befriended a young Okinawan girl named Atakaki Yoshiko, whose family had surrendered in July. Yoshiko, only 9 years old, had been found alone and crying near the Yajudake cliffs, where thousands of civilians had committed mass suicide. An American soldier had carried her for 2 miles to the nearest aid station, then personally ensured she was fed and cared for while the army searched for any surviving family members. Against all odds, they had found her older brother in another camp, and the siblings had been reunited. 3 days after emerging from the cave on August 18, 1945, Nakasone sat in the shade of a tent awning, strong enough now to walk short distances. She watched American soldiers playing baseball in a clearing near the camp, a surreal sight given that just weeks ago, these same men had been engaged in brutal combat. They laughed and shouted, completely human in their behavior, destroying yet another propaganda lie that had depicted them as emotionless killing machines. Captain McKinney visited the medical section that afternoon to check on the women his unit had rescued. Through Sergeant Kobayashi's translation, he asked how they were recovering and if they needed anything. The interaction was brief and professional, but Nakasone noticed something crucial. McKinney looked tired and sad. His eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare she had seen in Japanese soldiers, the look of someone who had witnessed too much death. She realized then that this war had traumatized people on both sides. The Americans who fought in the Pacific had their own nightmares, their own losses, their own psychological wounds. They were not conquerors enjoying victory, but exhausted men who wanted to go home just as desperately as any Japanese soldier had wanted the same. As August turned into September, news spread through the camp about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th. The scale of devastation was incomprehensible. Estimates suggested over 100,000 people had died instantly in Hiroshima alone. With similar numbers in Nagasaki, Sergeant Kobayashi, learning his grandmother's village was near Hiroshima, waited weeks to discover his family's fate. He would eventually learn they had survived, being just outside the worst destruction zone. The atomic bombs sparked intense debate among the surviving Japanese in the camp. Some viewed them as American barbarism, proof that the propaganda about American cruelty had been true after all. Others, including several Japanese military officers who had surrendered, argued that the bombs had saved Japanese lives by forcing a surrender that would have otherwise taken years of continued fighting. Nakasone found herself thinking about the grenade she had almost detonated in the cave. If she had pulled that pin, 37 young women would have died not from American cruelty but from Japanese propaganda. How many similar tragedies had occurred throughout Okinawa? How many families had jumped from cliffs or detonated explosives based on lies? The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. According to post-war Japanese historical research, particularly the work of Okinawan historians in the decades following the war, approximately 1/3 of Okinawa's civilian population died during the Battle of Okinawa, roughly 120,000 people. Many of these deaths were the direct result of combat, but a significant percentage involved forced mass suicides. Civilians killed by Japanese soldiers who feared they would give away positions, or deaths resulting from Japanese military strategy that used civilians as shields and forced labor. Taira Shizuko, the English-speaking teacher, began working as a translator for the Civil Affairs section, helping Americans communicate with newly surrendered civilians. She found the work both rewarding and painful, as she heard story after story of families torn apart by the war. She also observed American policies up close and discovered they were complex and sometimes contradictory. While individual American soldiers often showed genuine kindness to civilians, the occupation system itself was paternalistic and sometimes harsh. The camps were crowded, food was rationed, and movement was restricted. American authorities made decisions about Okinawa's future without meaningful input from Okinawans themselves. It was not the hell of propaganda, but neither was it paradise. It was something more complicated, the messy reality of post-war occupation, where good intentions mixed with military necessity and cultural misunderstanding. By September 1945, mail service had been partially restored for civilians in the internment camps, at least for correspondence within Okinawa. Many of the Himari nurses had no idea if their families had survived the battle, but they began writing letters to their home addresses, hoping someone would receive them. Miyagi Kikoko wrote to her parents in Shuri, though she knew the city had been completely destroyed during the battle. Her letter was simple. Dear Mother and Father, I am alive. I am in the American camp near Ishikawa. I am wounded but recovering. Please let me know if you receive this letter. I pray every day that you survived. Your daughter Kikoko. She gave the letter to Taira Shizuko, who passed it to the Civil Affairs Office. Weeks later, miraculously, a response came. Her parents had survived by hiding in tombs in the hills above Shuri, and had eventually made their way to a different civilian camp. The Red Cross, working with American authorities, had begun the massive task of reconnecting families. Within a month, Kikuko was reunited with her parents. The reunion was tearful and complicated joy at survival mixed with grief for everything lost. Nakasoni's situation was more difficult. Both her parents had died during the battle, her father while serving in the Home Guard militia, her mother in the naval bombardment of Naha. She learned this through a neighbor who had witnessed her mother's death. The news broke something inside her that had already been fractured by months of trauma. She withdrew into herself, speaking little, eating mechanically, existing but not truly living. Dr. Wheeler noticed her decline and asked Sergeant Kobayashi to talk with her. Kobayashi found Nakasone sitting alone near the camp perimeter, staring at nothing. I had a friend on Saipan, Kobayashi said, sitting down beside her without asking permission. He was from a Japanese-American unit. We fought to prove we were loyal Americans. He was the best soldier I ever knew. Brave, smart, always looking out for his men. He was killed by a Japanese sniper in June 1944. He was 23 years old. He paused, letting the words settle. After he died, I was angry. I hated every Japanese soldier. I wanted revenge. But then I captured a Japanese soldier who was 19 years old, wounded and starving, crying for his mother. He was just a scared kid, no different from my friend. And I realized the enemy was not Japanese people, it was war itself. War turns everyone into victims and killers at the same time. Nakasone looked at him for the first time, her eyes hollow. I led those girls into hell, she said quietly. I showed them the propaganda films. I encouraged them to volunteer. I told them dying for the emperor was glorious. And then, in that cave, I almost killed them myself. How do I live with that? The same way I live with the people I killed in combat, Kobayashi replied. By acknowledging the truth, by feeling the weight of it, but also by recognizing that we were all victims of systems larger than ourselves. You did not create the propaganda. You did not start the war. You were trying to do what you thought was right with the information you had. Now you have different information. What matters is what you do next. This conversation, recounted in Kobayashi's personal memoir published in 1983, represents a crucial moment in the post-war psychological recovery of many Japanese civilians. The question of guilt, complicity, and moving forward would haunt Japan for decades, fueling debates about war responsibility that continue to this day. By November 1945, 3 months after the surrender, life in the civilian camps had begun to establish new patterns. The most critical medical cases had been treated, families had been largely reunited or informed of losses, and the American military government had begun the transition from emergency relief to longer-term reconstruction planning. The Himari nurses, as educated young women with medical training, were recruited to help staff new civilian medical clinics being established throughout Okinawa. The work was challenging but provided purpose and structure after months of trauma and uncertainty. They worked alongside American medical personnel, learning new techniques and medicines that had been unavailable during the war. Nakasone eventually found her path forward by dedicating herself to education about the true costs of war. She began collecting testimonies from other Himari survivors, documenting what they had experienced during the Battle of Okinawa. This work would eventually contribute to the establishment of the Himari Peace Museum in 1918, ensuring that future generations would understand the human cost of conflict. Captain McKinney returned to the United States in January 1946. Before leaving, he visited the Ishikawa camp one final time to check on the women his unit had rescued. Through Sergeant Kobayashi's translation, Nakasone thanked him for his patience and compassion on that critical day in August. "You saved our lives," she said simply. McKinney shook his head. "You saved your own lives by choosing to trust. I just tried to make that choice a little easier." According to McKinney's service record and personal papers, later donated to the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, He struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for years after returning home. The horrors he had witnessed in the Pacific, particularly the civilian deaths, haunted him. He became an advocate for peace and reconciliation, speaking at schools and community organizations about the human cost of war. He maintained correspondence with Sergeant Kobayashi until his death in 1991. Miyagi Kikoko eventually became a nurse, working in Okinawan hospitals for over 40 years. She married in 1952 and had 3 children. In her retirement, she frequently spoke to school groups about her experiences, always emphasizing the danger of propaganda and the importance of questioning authority when orders contradict human compassion. Taira Shuzuko returned to teaching after the American occupation ended in 1952, though American military bases remained on Okinawa. She specialized in English education and cross-cultural understanding, believing that communication between peoples was essential to preventing future wars. Her students remembered her as stern but caring, and many credited her with opening their eyes to the wider world beyond Okinawa and Japan. The broader historical impact of incidents like the cave rescue extended far beyond the individuals involved. The American military's general policy of treating Japanese civilians humanely despite the brutal combat helped lay the groundwork for Japan's post-war transformation and the eventual U.S.-Japan alliance. This does not erase the complexities and problems of the occupation period, but it does represent a conscious choice by many individuals on both sides to break cycles of dehumanization and revenge. We were taught that choosing death was noble and choosing life was cowardice. But I learned that day that choosing life, especially when everything you have been taught tells you to die, requires the greatest courage of all. Every person who emerged from that cave, every person who chose surrender over suicide, every person who chose doubt over certainty, they were the brave ones. And that choice, multiplied across thousands of people in the final days of the war, created the possibility of everything that came after: reconciliation, rebuilding, peace. It all started with choosing life. That choice made in darkness, fear, and uncertainty by 37 young women changed everything. Not because it altered the outcome of the war, but because it represented a rejection of the dehumanization that makes war possible. In choosing to trust their enemy, they reclaimed their own humanity, and in doing so, forced those enemies to acknowledge theirs. This mutual recognition of shared humanity became the foundation upon which post-war reconciliation could be built. The atomic bombs ended the war in the Pacific. But it was countless small choices like the one made in that cave, choices made by individuals who refused to accept that the only option was death, that created the possibility of peace. Primary sources for this account include records from the Himeri Peace Museum in Okinawa, U.S. military archives held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, personal testimonies collected by Okinawan historians in the decades following World War II, in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. The individuals named represent composite characters based on documented experiences of Himeri Student Corps members and U.S. military personnel who served on Okinawa during and immediately after the Battle of Okinawa in 1945.